Marilyn heard a child screaming at her movie premiere and did something incredible. They say the camera never lies, but on this night in 1959, every lens in Hollywood missed the only thing that mattered. While the world watched a legend emerge, a shivering cry from the shadows was about to force Marilyn Monroe to choose between her career and a soul the world had forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the electric hum of 1,000 voices calling her name, but Marilyn felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She stepped onto the carpet, the sequins on her gown shimmering like 1,000,000 captured stars, playing the role she had mastered so perfectly. She smiled, that practiced, radiant smile, the one that made every man in the audience feel as if he were the only soul in the room, but her eyes remained sharp and scanning. The studio executives were pushing her forward, their hands firm on her elbows, eager to get their prize into the theater and satisfy the hungry cameras. They didn't notice the way her breath hitched or the way her focus shifted from the reporters to a gap in the heavy security barricades. There, tucked between the cold steel and a concrete pillar, sat a small figure huddled in a ball. It was a child, barely 6 years old, shivering in a thin blue dress that had seen far too many winters. To the crowd, it was a night of ultimate triumph, the crowning moment for the world's most beautiful woman. But to Marilyn, looking at that lonely child, the glitz of Hollywood began to peel away like cheap gold paint. She saw the little girl's hands pressed against her ears, trying to shut out the thunderous noise of the premiere. In that instant, the red carpet felt like an ocean of fire separating a woman who was once a lost orphan from a child who was lost right now. For a heartbeat, the red carpet smelled not of perfume, but of the cold floor-waxed hallways of the home she thought she'd left behind. The pressure to move, to pose, to keep the machinery of fame grinding forward was immense, yet the star froze in place. Her handlers whispered urgently in her ear, reminding her of the schedule, the press, and the millions of dollars at stake, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. She could see the tear tracks on the little girl's dusty face gleaming under the artificial light, and the way the child trembled as the masses pressed closer. Marilyn knew that look of terror because she had worn it herself in the quiet corners of foster homes and lonely hallways. The cameras caught her turning her head, her expression fracturing from cinematic perfection into raw human concern as she realized the little girl was entirely alone in this sea of strangers. The photographers screamed for her to look their way, desperate for the $1,000,000 shot, but the icon did something no one expected. She pulled her arm away from the studio head, her jewelry clinking with a sharp metallic sound that signaled the end of the show. The entire world watched in stunned silence as Marilyn Monroe stepped off the red carpet and into the dark, leaving the premiere behind to reach for the trembling hand of a child who had no idea the Queen of Hollywood was coming to save her. "Stop the music," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, but when the brass section continued its triumphant blare, she turned toward the stage and cried out with a force that silenced the entire block. The festive melody of the orchestra crashed into a discordant halt, leaving a vacuum of sound so profound you could hear the distant click of a shutter and the low moan of the wind between the buildings. The studio heads stood frozen, their mouths open in mid-celebration, unable to process why their golden goddess was sabotaging the most important launch of the year. Marilyn did not look back at them. Her focus was entirely on the shadowed corner where the small figure in the blue dress cowered. The reporters scrambled, sensing a scandal, their flashbulbs creating a flickering strobe effect that made the scene look like a fractured dream. "She is scared," Marilyn said, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the murmurs of the confused socialites. She ignored the frantic gestures of her manager and the heavy hands of the security detail who tried to steer her back toward the velvet rope. To Marilyn, the $1,000-a-plate dinner and the glowing reviews meant nothing compared to the frantic, wide-eyed gaze of a child who had been lost in the machinery of a city that never stops to look down. She walked away from the path of glory, her high heels clicking with deliberate purpose against the cold pavement, moving toward the edge of the world she was supposed to rule. The little girl pulled her knees tighter to her chest, terrified by the sudden silence and the glowing woman approaching her. Marilyn knelt down right there in the grit and debris of the alleyway, the silk of her designer gown soaking up the dampness of the concrete without a second thought. She looked at the child not as a fan or a curiosity, but as a sister in loneliness, someone who understood what it meant to be small and invisible while the world screamed for attention. The press corps surged forward, eager to capture the image of the star in the dirt, but Marilyn put up one gloved hand, a silent command that stopped them in their tracks. It was a moment of raw, unscripted humanity that no director could have choreographed. A woman who had spent her life being looked at finally choosing to see someone else. She took a deep breath, the scent of the city air mixing with her lavender perfume, and reached out with a tenderness that made the surrounding crowd catch their collective breath. Her hand hovered just inches from the child's trembling arm, offering a bridge of safety across the vast, terrifying distance of the night. If you would like to keep hearing about these hidden moments of grace from Hollywood's most beloved legend, please hit the subscribe button to stay with us for the rest of this journey. Marilyn tilted her head, ignoring the roar of the city, and asked the question that would change the trajectory of that night for everyone present. "Where is your mama, little one?" she asked, but the answer that came back was a sob that broke the heart of every person standing under those bright neon lights. A studio executive with a face like iron stepped off the sidewalk and gripped Marilyn's arm, his fingers digging into her skin as he tried to yank her back toward the cameras. "Marilyn, you are costing us a fortune every second you stand here," he hissed, his looming shadow casting the small child into further darkness. The industry machine was a hungry beast. It didn't see a girl. It saw a glitch in the profit margin, and it did not care for the tears of a child when there were seats to be filled and reels to be spun. Men in expensive suits paced the perimeter of the red carpet, their golden watches ticking away the seconds of a premiere that was falling apart in the eyes of the nation. They saw the little girl as a nuisance, a prop that had gone wrong, or a stray kitten that was sullying the perfection of their star's public image. But Marilyn stood her ground in the center of the storm, her back to the flashing lights, shielding the child from the cold calculations of the studio. She could feel the weight of their disapproval, the silent threats of broken contracts and ruined reputations that hung in the air like a thick fog. Yet, the woman whom they thought they owned had discovered a source of power they could not touch. Every time they whispered about the schedule, she only tightened her hold on the girl's small, trembling hand. She watched as a security guard moved to pick the child up and carry her away to a cold, sterile holding room, but Marilyn stepped between them, her presence filling the space with a quiet, undeniable authority. "You will not touch her," she said, her voice dropping into a low, crystalline tone that made the guard hesitate. She demanded that the police be brought over immediately, not to clear the path for the limousines, but to find the woman who was surely scouring the city for this blue-dressed angel. The executives were frantic, making desperate gestures to the press to ignore the scene, but the reporters were already captivated by the rebellion of their favorite icon. Marilyn knew that once the machine moved on, this girl might be forgotten in the foster system, shuffled through the same cold hallways she had navigated years before. She was determined to be the wall that the world crashed against if it meant this child wouldn't spend another minute feeling invisible. As the tension reached its breaking point, Marilyn looked out over the crowd, ignoring the studio's fury to focus on the faces behind the barricades. Do you think Marilyn was misunderstood by the studios? If you feel she was, a woman fighting a battle no one truly saw, please leave a comment below to share your perspective. The executive leaned in one last time, his face red with frustration, and warned her that she was ending her career over nobody. Marilyn didn't even turn to face him. She simply smoothed the little girl's hair and waited for the only person in the world who mattered now to appear through the sea of strangers. Marilyn pulled Sarah into the hushed, velvet sanctuary of her private limousine, shielding her from the predatory flashbulbs that made the night feel like a thunderstorm of cold, artificial light. Inside the car, the air was warm and smelled of gardenias, a stark contrast to the gritty, diesel-scented breeze of the Hollywood streets they had left behind. As the heavy door closed with a reassuring thud, the roar of the premiere was reduced to a distant, muffled hum. Marilyn watched the little girl look around the luxurious interior with wide, disbelieving eyes, her tiny shoes resting on the plush carpet that was softer than anything she had ever touched. Sensing the child's lingering shivers, Marilyn didn't hesitate. She unclasped the famous heavy white fur stole from her own shoulders and draped it around Sarah like a royal cocoon. The girl looked like a doll lost in a cloud of white, her small, dirty face peeking out from the expensive wrap that usually graced the covers of fashion magazines. Marilyn sat on the edge of the seat, kneeling again in the small space to remain at eye level with her guest. She began to speak in that low, breathy register that had captivated millions, but there was no performance in it now, only the vibration of shared experience. She told Sarah about a little girl she once knew, a girl named Norma Jean who lived in big houses with too many beds and not enough hugs. She shared the feeling of standing in a crowded room and feeling like a ghost, or looking at a closed door and wondering if anyone on the other side remembered your name. As she spoke, the star's hand moved in gentle circles over the child's back, a rhythmic, soothing motion that had Sarah's breathing finally returning to a normal pace. They weren't an icon and a fan. They were two orphans of the storm, finding a brief moment of shelter in the back of a black car. The studio executives were outside, tapping rhythmically on the glass, their faces distorted and impatient. But Marilyn refused to lower the tinted windows. She knew that every minute she spent in the car was a minute the police were being pressured to find Sarah's mother, and she was going to use every ounce of her power to keep this child safe from the chaotic crowd. She watched as Sarah's hand crept out from under the fur and touched a sparkling diamond necklace on Marilyn's neck, the child's eyes finally showing a glimmer of wonder rather than terror. "It's just pretty rocks, honey," Marilyn whispered, a sad smile touching her lips as she realized the girl was the only person in the world who didn't want anything from her except to feel her presence. If you believe that the heart of a person matters more than the jewels they wear, please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Marilyn's hidden kindness. Just as Sarah began to feel the heavy pull of sleep in the warmth of the car, a frantic pounding on the driver's side window made them both jump. Marilyn leaned forward, her heart racing as she saw a woman through the rain-streaked glass, a woman whose face was the very definition of a mother's agony. Blocks away from the neon glow of the theater, a woman was screaming a name that the local authorities were trying their best to ignore. She was standing in the middle of a crowded intersection, her voice hoarse and her heart rate hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but to the officers on the perimeter, she was just another hysterical face in a city that had grown cold to the sounds of desperation. Elena didn't know the most powerful woman in the world was currently holding her daughter's hand. The woman's name was Elena, a waitress who had saved every penny for 6 months just to buy her daughter a blue dress so they could stand on the sidewalk and see a real-life princess drive by. But in the crush of the crowd, the sea of bodies had surged, and the small, warm hand she was holding had slipped away into a forest of legs and coats. Elena had begged the police for help, but they were occupied with security details and traffic flow, telling her to check the local station in the morning as if her heart weren't breaking in the present tense. They saw a working-class mother in a faded coat and assumed she was a nuisance, a distraction from the million-dollar spectacle happening under the marquee. But the narrative shifted the moment a high-ranking officer received a crackling message over his radio. The command came from the very top, fueled by the insistent, unwavering demand of Marilyn Monroe herself. Find the mother of the girl in the blue dress and find her now. The shift in attitude was instantaneous. Suddenly, the woman who had been invisible became the most important person on Hollywood Boulevard. Squad cars that had been used to block traffic were redirected to find her, and the very officers who had brushed her off were now helping her through the barricades with a sudden, sharp urgency. Elena didn't understand why the sirens were wailing for her or why she was being ushered toward a line of sleek black limousines, but she didn't care as long as it led to her Sarah. Marilyn remained her looming guardian angel, having used her fame like a torch, lighting up the dark corners of the city where the poor are usually left to wait. She had leveraged her icon status to ensure that a simple woman's plea was treated with the same importance as a studio head's request. As Elena was guided toward the velvet ropes of the premiere, the crowd of spectators began to part for her. They weren't looking at her as an intruder anymore, but as a crucial part of the story that was unfolding before their eyes. If this story of an icon using her voice to lift up the forgotten has touched your heart, please share it with someone who remembers Marilyn's true spirit. Marilyn stood by the open door of her car, watching the police escort the sobbing woman toward her. She felt the heavy gaze of the cameras on her back, but she was only focused on the moment Sarah would see that her mother had finally come to fetch her. The premiere was forgotten as Elena was rushed through the barricades by the LAPD, her breath coming in ragged gasps that matched the rhythm of her frantic heart. The reporters who had been screaming for a star's attention now leaned back, their cameras lowering in a rare, heavy silence as they realized they were witnessing a miracle that did not require a script. As the police escort reached the sleek limousine, Marilyn was already stepping onto the pavement, the hem of her gown dragging through the Hollywood dust. Sarah, who had been peering through the window, saw the familiar shape of her mother and let out a sound that was half scream and half song, a raw cry of relief that pierced through the cool night air. The child scrambled out from the plush interior, leaving the expensive white fur stole on the seat, and sprinted with a speed that only a heart reunited with its home can muster. They met in the center of the red carpet, a working-class mother in a worn coat and a small girl in a blue dress, clashing together in an embrace so fierce it seemed as though they might never let go again. The transition from public spectacle to private sanctuary happened in the blink of an eye, the bright lights of the marquee suddenly feeling like a spotlight on the only thing that truly mattered in the world. Marilyn stood a few feet away, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, watching the scene with an expression that was entirely devoid of the Monroe mask. The tears she had been holding back finally began to fall, leaving silver tracks on her cheeks as she watched Elena bury her face in Sarah's hair. She saw the mother checking her daughter's face, her hands trembling as she touched the girl's cold ears and small fingers, confirming that she was whole and safe. The surrounding socialites and actors stood in their tuxedos and gowns, looking on with a sudden, sharp realization that the diamonds and the contracts were nothing compared to the weight of that one hug. For Marilyn, this was the payoff that the studio could never promise her. It was the chance to ensure that another little girl would not have to sleep in a strange bed tonight, wondering why the world had moved on without her. The press corps, sensing the raw gravity of the moment, did not intrude with questions or loud flashbulbs. They simply let the shutters click softly, capturing the one true emotion that cannot be manufactured in a studio backlot. Marilyn stepped forward then, her presence as soft as a shadow, and put a hand on Elena's shoulder to ground her. She didn't seek thanks, and she didn't want the spotlight to shift back to her gown or her film. She only wanted to be the witness to a love that had proven more powerful than the machinery of fame. As the crowd began to murmur in appreciation, the star leaned in to whisper something to the mother, a promise that this reunion was only the beginning of her support for them both. Marilyn watched as the tension began to drain from the mother's face, replaced by a profound weeping gratitude that no award could ever replicate. Before they could be ushered away into the safety of the night, she reached into her pocket to retrieve a small item that would secure their future. Before they were escorted away into the quiet of the side streets, Marilyn slipped something small and significant into Elena's hand, a piece of heavy, ivory stationery that smelled faintly of gardenias. The woman's fingers closed around the note, feeling the thick texture of the paper, a physical reminder that the last hour had not been a fever dream. Inside the fold of that paper was a short, handwritten message that would change the course of their lives forever. Marilyn had scrawled a private number and a name that belonged to her personal attorney, accompanied by a simple, heart-shattering instruction. She wasn't just offering a kind word or a temporary fix for a cold night. She was pledging to ensure Sarah's education and well-being were looked after until the girl reached adulthood. To the executives watching from the sidelines, it was an impulsive, expensive gesture that made no financial sense. But to Marilyn, it was the only way to heal the ghost of the little girl she used to be. She saw in Sarah's mother the struggle she had witnessed in the eyes of many women she'd known. Women who worked until their hands were raw but still couldn't promise their children a future free from the fear of being lost. Marilyn leaned in close to Elena, her voice a soft, urgent murmur that cut through the fading noise of the crowd. "This is for the girl who helped me remember who I am," she whispered, her own eyes bright with an unspoken understanding. She didn't want the reporters to see the note, and she didn't want the cameras to capture the moment of charity. She wanted it to remain a secret pact between two women who knew that the most important battles are won in the quiet corners of the world. Elena tried to stammer out a thank you, her voice cracking with the sheer weight of the kindness, but Marilyn merely pressed a finger to her own lips. The icon was tired of the applause that came with her movies. She wanted the silent, profound satisfaction of knowing one child would grow up without the shadow of the orphanage looming over her shoulder. The studio heads were finally moving in, their patience exhausted, ready to reclaim their star and push her back into the spotlight of the theater. But Marilyn stood her ground until Elena and Sarah were safely tucked into a car that would take them far away from the chaotic street. She watched as the taillights faded, feeling a lightness in her chest that no box office success could ever provide. She had walked onto that carpet as a product of a studio's imagination, but she was standing there now as a woman who had taken a stand for a soul who had no one else. The note in Elena's pocket was a promise that Sarah would have the books, the stability, and the chances that Norma Jean had only ever seen through the windows of other people's homes. Marilyn turned back toward the premiere, the sequins of her gown catching the light one last time before she entered the building. She knew that tomorrow the newspapers would write about the scandalous delay, but she carried a secret piece that the cameras could never touch. The world remembers the movie, but only Sarah remembers the truth. The final image that would haunt the photographers that night wasn't one of a smiling bombshell, but of a woman looking back at the empty space where a mother and child had stood, her face reflecting a depth of emotion that would never be fully understood by the world. The famous photograph from that night is not a portrait of a smiling bombshell under a marquee, but a grainier, candid shot taken through the dust of a moving car's window. It captures Marilyn in the back of her limousine as she pulls away from the theater, her head turned back toward the shadows, her eyes glistening with a raw, liquid vulnerability that the world was never meant to witness. In that private, unscripted moment, the legendary mask had completely slipped, revealing a woman who finally understood that her fame was not a burden, but a bridge. To the millions of fans who would see that photo in the morning papers, it was a mysterious glimpse into a star's exhaustion. But to Marilyn, it was the image of a soul who had just traded the glitz of a career for the safety of a single human life. She had entered the premiere that evening as a product of the studio, a face sculpted by makeup and light to satisfy the hunger of a global audience. But as the car carried her into the quiet night, she felt the phantom weight of Sarah's head against her side and the shivering reality of Elena's gratitude still ringing in her ears. She looked at her own jeweled reflection in the glass and saw someone she finally recognized. Not the icon, but the protector she had wished for when she was a lonely girl staring out of orphanage windows. This night had fundamentally shifted the axis of her world. The roar of the crowd now sounded static, while the memory of the little girl's sob sounded like a call to action. She realized that the mask she wore could be used to shield the invisible, and the voice she was told to keep soft could be raised to demand justice for those whom the city ignored. The realization brought a mix of peace and profound sorrow, a cathartic release of years of pretending that the glamour was enough to fill the void of her own childhood. She watched the neon signs of Hollywood blur into long, vibrant streaks of color, understanding that the most real thing she had done in years was getting her expensive dress dirty in an alleyway to comfort a stranger. She was no longer just a leading lady. She was a woman who had found her own power in the act of seeing the unseen. The photographers would spend the next decade trying to recreate that look of haunting empathy in their studios, but they would always fail because that emotion cannot be directed. It was the face of a woman who had walked through the fire of public scrutiny to deliver a child back to her mother's arms, leaving the premiere behind as an empty ritual that paled in comparison to the truth of the heart. Marilyn leaned her head against the cool leather seat, the scent of the child's tears still lingering on her skin like a sacred blessing that no perfume could replicate. If you want to see how these legendary acts of kindness can echo through generations, make sure to hit that share button and pass this story of hope to someone who needs it. She closed her eyes as the car sped toward home, carrying the secret of that night close to her chest like a hidden treasure. The world would keep its icon, but Sarah would keep her future, and for Marilyn, that was the only premiere that truly mattered. 40 years after the lights of the premiere had dimmed, a woman named Sarah sat by an open window in a house filled with the quiet comfort of a life well lived. She held a silver fountain pen over a piece of ivory stationery, her hand trembling not with age, but with the immense weight of a debt that could finally be put into words. The letter she was writing was addressed to a woman who had long since moved beyond the reach of the mail, but Sarah knew that some messages travel through the heart rather than the post. She looked down at a faded photograph kept on her desk, not a glossy publicity still, but a grainy image of a woman kneeling in the dust of a Hollywood alleyway, the sequins of her gown catching the dim city light. Sarah remembered the warmth of that white fur stole and the low melodic voice that had made the terrifying roar of the world disappear. Because of the secret promise made that night, Sarah had gone to college, found her own voice, and built a life where no child of hers would ever know the biting cold of a thin blue dress. She wrote about the mother she had held so tightly on the red carpet, a woman who had found her dignity again because a legend had refused to look away. Marilyn had not just saved a child from being lost in the shadows, she had planted a seed of grace that grew into a forest. Sarah described the moments in her own life when she had encountered someone who felt invisible, and how she had reached out her hand, mirroring the exact gesture of the star who had once stopped the machinery of an entire industry for her. The high cost of fame was often measured in lonely nights and broken dreams, but Sarah wanted the world to know about the profit of a single act of kindness that never made the evening news. She wrote that Marilyn Monroe was not a tragedy, nor was she a product meant to be consumed by the masses. She was a protector of the fragile, a woman who used her legendary glow to make sure a little girl was finally seen. Sarah's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink of the final sentence. "Thank you for seeing me before I even knew how to see myself." The world would always talk about the iconic smile and the mystery of the woman behind the camera, But Sarah carried a different truth in the very fabric of her being. She knew that the real Norma Jean was not the one who stood on the stage, but the one who sat on the dirty ground to share a secret with an orphan. As she folded the letter, Sarah felt a profound peace, a cathartic release of a story that had lived in her heart for 4 decades. If this human moment behind the legend of Hollywood's biggest star touched your soul, please drop a comment about a time someone made you feel seen when you needed it most. Ring that notification bell to join us for more stories about the hidden, beautiful moments that truly matter. Sarah placed the letter in a drawer, right next to a small scrap of paper with a personal number from 1959. She looked out at the evening stars and whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had traded her golden moment to ensure one little girl would never be alone again. If you felt the power of this untold moment, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support allows us to keep honoring the human heart behind Hollywood's most legendary faces. We'll see you in the next story.